Photos are a good way of capturing moments and images of people in our lives that we want to remember forever. But not all photos are as they seem. In some cases, certain images seem completely innocent until we learn about the backstories that they contain, and they're never viewed the same way again. In October 2024, 51-year-old Suzanne Simpson was living in San Antonio, Texas with her husband, Brad. They had 4 children together, and Suzanne was employed as a luxury real estate agent. On the 6th of October that year, Suzanne and Brad attended a birthday party at the Argyle in Alamo Heights, Texas. For most of the night, the party continued without incident, but at around 11 p.m., a witness saw the couple arguing and would later report that the fight got physical at one point. A neighbor would state that he heard screams coming from a nearby wooded area after learning that Suzanne had gone missing and could not be located. He added that during the argument, it became obvious that Suzanne was trying to get away from Brad, but he prevented her from leaving. At 3 p.m. the next day, the couple's children's school contacted Brad to report that Suzanne had not picked them up, and the authorities were notified. The lead investigator in her case then contacted Brad to set up a meeting about the case, but Brad failed to show up and then refused to cooperate with the police. After an appeal was made for anyone who saw Brad's black truck being driven in certain areas to come forward, several witnesses contacted the police to state that they'd seen him driving in different areas with large trash bags and a tarp in the back of a vehicle the day after Suzanne disappeared. It was later reported when he traveled to the school to get his children, these items were no longer in the truck, and he'd removed a firewood rack from the truck's bed. Then he traveled to the bubble bath car wash, where he washed and cleaned the driver's side and left the rear passenger sides of the vehicle. In a surveillance photo, investigators spotted a 30-ounce bottle of Clorox, which is a cleaning product, on the back seat. Brad then texted a friend, asking him to meet up at his house and adding that he didn't have much time. The friend stated he'd be there in 40 minutes, and Brad then instructed him to leave unknown items in the pump house, making sure to mention a firearm that was also to be left behind. Later that night, the same friend texted Brad telling him to, quote, "get over here," and stating that he won't tell anyone. On the 8th of October, Brad was seen standing next to a fire pit, and when it was searched later on, investigators found a burnt laptop and 3 cell phones that had been destroyed by the fire. It's believed that the 3 phones belonged to Brad, and that he was attempting to get rid of evidence. While the search for Suzanne was ongoing, the last known photo of her, which was taken by a security camera, was released in hopes that someone had seen her, but no one came forward with any new information. With this evidence in hand, Brad was taken into custody the next day, and according to investigators, he seemed completely unfazed by his wife's disappearance and the fact that he was named as a suspect. He stated that Suzanne had lost her phone at an H-E-B store on the day of her disappearance, and that he had no idea where she was. Suzanne's banker then came forward to report that she'd made a strange statement to him. She said that if she ever went missing, the police should look for her in a lake, but she didn't elaborate on that statement, and the investigation into her case remains active, and Suzanne's current whereabouts remain unknown. This photo, which is entitled Burst of Joy, shows a family being reunited with a soldier, Lieutenant Robert L. Sturm, after he was released from a Vietnamese prison camp during the Vietnam War. With no context, one might assume that the family went on to live happily ever after, but sadly that's not the case. Robert was born in San Francisco in 1933, and in 1953, he enlisted in the Aviation Cadet Program of the U.S. Air Force. After completing the necessary training, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, but he started his military career as a radar observer until 1959, when he was finally awarded his wings. He then completed his advanced interceptor pilot training and became an F-102 Delta Dagger pilot in Washington. Following this, he served as an F-106 Delta Dart pilot and an assistant chief of the exercise branch at McChord Air Force Base. He'd racked up hundreds of flight hours, and by 1967, he joined the 333rd Tactical Fighter Squadron at Tockley Royal Thai Air Force Base. In August of that year, he was flying over North Vietnam when his plane was damaged, and he had no choice but to eject, landing with his parachute in enemy territory. He was captured by the Viet Cong on the 27th of August, and his family was informed of the incident. They feared they'd never see him alive again, since very few prisoners of war were willingly released during the Vietnam War. While in prison, Sturm was subjected to hours of interrogation, solitary confinement, and mock executions that took a toll on his mental health. But he was able to communicate with another POW, John McCain, by tapping on his cell wall, and the pair somehow managed to keep their spirits up. For the next 5 years, Sturm kept hope alive by often thinking about his family back home and imagining the day that he would finally be reunited with his wife and children. On the 27th of January, 1973, a ceasefire was agreed upon in North Vietnam, and it was arranged that US soldiers in South Vietnam would be evacuated. It was agreed that 600 US prisoners of war would be released, one of whom was Sturm. The following month, planes were sent to fetch the prisoners, who were then taken to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Sturm was one of 20 POWs who arrived at Travis Air Force Base on the 17th of March that year, and photographer Slava Vetter was present to capture the iconic moment when he was greeted by his family. This photo shows 38-year-old plant mechanic Greg Monks while he was attending a stag party in Portugal in June of 2025, and it's clear that he's having a good time. But this is the last time that he was seen alive, and the investigation into his case is still ongoing. Greg hailed from Scotland, and on the 28th of May, he and a group of friends traveled to Portugal, where they checked into the Nova Choro apartments. From there, they planned to visit several bars in the area to celebrate a friend's upcoming wedding. They were supposed to remain in Portugal for 5 days, but just hours after setting out from the apartments, something went wrong. The group had been out for a few hours, having drinks and food, and at some point in the early morning hours, Greg decided to head back to his apartment. He bid his friends goodnight and started back on his own, but when they tried to rouse him the next morning, they were surprised to find he wasn't in his room. The police and Greg's family were informed, and it was later revealed that he was last seen on CCTV footage in a quiet residential area about 4 miles from the apartments. Searches of that area were immediately organized, and his family and girlfriend flew out to Portugal to assist. The last image of Greg was spread far and wide in hopes that someone had seen him and that they could point the police in the right direction, but no such information was received. His friends stated that they last saw Greg while they were having drinks in the King's Cross karaoke bar, from where he decided to walk back to his accommodation. It was speculated that he got lost along the way and was unable to find his way back, but his continued absence became a major cause for concern. The group of friends eventually traveled back to Scotland without locating Greg, but the authorities in Portugal continued searching for him. The police asked that anyone with CCTV footage of Greg contact them, and this resulted in the first major clue. A man living in a luxury villa in an area of scrubland responded and stated that they should search the nearby hillside. Sniffer dogs were brought in and immediately led searchers to an area in the scrubland. Tragically, Greg's family was informed that he'd been found deceased. His remains were recovered, and after an autopsy was performed, the events of that morning became much clearer. It was established that after he left the karaoke bar, Greg became disoriented and lost. He then walked to the area where he was eventually found, where he slipped and fell into a ravine, losing his life in the process. Greg's family accepted this outcome, and they've stated that they don't suspect foul play to be involved, though they are struggling to come to terms with the tragic series of events that claimed his life. Many people around the world consider golf to be a boring and long-winded sport, but there's no doubt that its biggest stars, such as Tiger Woods, Gary Player, and Rory McIlroy, have enjoyed very lucrative careers as golf professionals. For example, in 2025 alone, Scottie Scheffler earned a mammoth $27 million by winning several tournaments. The average earnings of a tour professional come in at around $3 million every year, not only in modern times, but over the course of several decades. In 1999, the US golfer Payne Stewart had earned around $2.07 million, but over the course of his long career, he earned around $12 million. It comes as no surprise then that he decided to purchase a Learjet 35 private plane, which he used to travel between gold tournaments and to attend business meetings. A photo taken earlier that year shows the plane on full display at Orlando's International Airport, from where it was chartered by Sunjet Aviation. At the time, Stewart had just won the US Open and was slated to represent the US at the Ryder Cup, but he never got the chance to do so. In October of that year, he competed in the National Car Rental Golf Classic, where he tied for 11th place and was slated to play in the tournament championship that was being held in Houston, Texas. On the 25th of October, 1999, he asked for his jet to be readied, and the pilot, Michael King, arrived at Orlando Sanford International Airport to complete the necessary checks. A cooler and snack basket were brought aboard for the flight, and the plane was filled with 5,300 pounds of fuel. At 7:45 that morning, the plane took off and headed to Orlando International Airport about 25 minutes later. There, Payne and 3 other passengers, Robert Fraley, Bruce Borland, and Ivan Arden, got onto the jet, and at 9:19 they took off towards Dallas. The pilot was instructed to climb to 26,000 feet. At 9:27, instruction was given to climb 39,000 feet, and King did so after acknowledging the call. 6 minutes later, panic started to set in at the Jacksonville Air Route Traffic Control Center when they were unable to make contact with Payne's plane. Instructions had been sent for King to connect to a different radio control tower, but he failed to respond. For the next few minutes, the air traffic controller made several attempts to re-establish contact, but to no avail. It was then revealed that the plane had been climbing and dipping between 22,000 and 51,000 feet before going missing, likely due to the autopilot having been switched on. It was noticed that a US Air Force test pilot was in the air nearby, and he was instructed to find Payne's jet, which he then did. He stated it was cruising at an altitude of 46,000 feet, and he attempted to make radio contact, but to no avail. At 11 a.m., the fighter jet pilot reported that Payne's plane seemed to be in good shape, but he was unable to see inside thanks to condensation that had accumulated on the windows. By 12:16, 2 more jets had arrived, but failed to make contact with the plane, and it was estimated it had about an hour's worth of fuel remaining. It was guessed that it would crash in Winnipeg, and to avoid a massive disaster, the order was given to shoot the plane down unless contact could be established before it entered Canadian airspace. At 1:10 p.m., the plane's fuel started to run out, and the engines could be heard winding down. A minute later, the plane started to bank to the right and then started rolling in the air, clearly out of control. At 1:13, the plane broke through the clouds and crashed onto a farm in Edmonds County, South Dakota, ending the lives of everyone on board. It would later be revealed that the cause of the crash was a loss of cabin pressure, which led the passengers to become hypoxic due to a lack of oxygen. The cause of the depressurization was never determined, and the golfing world was left to mourn the loss of one of its greatest players. This photo shows Phineas Gage holding the metal tamping rod involved in a horrific accident that changed his life. Born in New Hampshire, Gage worked as a construction foreman for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. His job involved using explosives to remove rock, which required drilling a hole, adding gunpowder, placing a layer of sand, and then compacting the charge with the tamping rod before ignition. On September 13, 1848, near Cavendish, Vermont, Gage forgot the layer of sand. When he compacted the explosive, the rod struck the rock, prematurely igniting the powder. His coworkers would find him conscious nearby. They soon realized the 3.58-foot rod had traveled through his skull, entering below his cheekbone and exiting the top of his head. But somehow, miraculously, he survived and was discharged. But Gabe was a changed man, rude, unprofessional, and restless. He left the railroad, moving to Chile to work as a stagecoach driver, and later to California. He began suffering from epileptic seizures, and he would pass away 12 years after the injury. This photo is the only known image of Gage, and the tamping rod is displayed at Harvard Medical School's Warren Anatomical Museum. Scuba diving is a very popular hobby that's enjoyed by millions of people around the world, but any scuba diver will admit that it can be very dangerous, not only due to some difficult areas that they explore, but also due to possible equipment failures while a diver is deep under the water. One notable incident that's still spoken about in scuba diving circles is an accident involving Yuri Lipsky, a Russian-Israeli diving instructor who had a lot of experience with the sport, and who had, in April of 2000, decided to take on a very dangerous challenge. One of the last known photos of Lipsky showed him gathering his equipment before taking on a dive at the notorious Blue Hole in Dahab, Egypt. The area is considered extremely dangerous due to an underwater area known as the Arch, where divers need to keep their wits about them while extremely deep under the water's surface. Many divers have become disoriented while taking on the Blue Hole and just barely escaped with their lives, vowing to never return. Even if a diver were to traverse the dangers of this area successfully, they still need to make a very controlled ascent back to the surface, all the while ensuring that they have enough oxygen left in their tanks. Lipsky was well aware of these dangers, but being very experienced, he was confident that he could complete the technical dive, and on the 28th of April that year, he arrived at the Blue Hole with his equipment at the ready. His fellow divers would later state that he'd not properly prepared for the dive, and that he didn't have enough training to complete it successfully, but Lipsky would not be deterred from his goal, even taking a video camera down with him to record his achievement. He decided to enter the water with just one tank of what he assumed was the correct mix of gases, but this amount of air would only last long enough for him to complete a part of the dive, and when he decided to overshoot that mark, his fate was sealed. Having added weights to his scuba gear, Lipsky sank further than he had anticipated, and in the footage that he shot of the dive, he could be heard trying to inflate his buoyancy compensator device, but his efforts were in vain. Tarek Omar, a diver who knew Lipsky well, would state that he did his utmost to dissuade him from taking on the dive, but Lipsky ignored his warnings. Omar would later dive down to the bottom of the Blue Hole to retrieve Lipsky's remains, and there he found the camera that was used to film these tragic events. This photo looks like a still from a Hollywood movie created through special effects, but nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, it shows the 2010 eruption of a volcano in Iceland against the backdrop of a borealis, which is a strange light display caused by charged particles from the sun that collide with gases in our atmosphere. The mountain seen in this photo is called Eyjafjallajökull, which in that year had started exhibiting seismic activity. In March, the first eruption occurred on the northeast flank of the mountain, and at first it seemed as though it would be unremarkable, but in April, it became apparent that the event would become much larger than expected when further eruptions started in the center of the volcano, which contained a 1.8-mile wide crater that contained a lot of ice. As the mountains started to heat up, the ice started to melt and it flowed into the volcano, eventually reaching the magma beneath the Earth's crust. This resulted in the formation of massive amounts of steam and ash that were then ejected from the mountain at massive speeds. The ash that was sent high into the atmosphere then entered a jet stream that carried it across several countries, including Norway, the Faroe Islands, and parts of Great Britain. As a result, airplanes were grounded, and the Icelandic government declared a state of emergency. The rest of Europe followed suit, and air travel came to a complete standstill. Every day that went by cost airlines as much as $171 million in revenue, but many other sectors were also affected. Passengers were left stranded in foreign countries, and calls were made for the National Center of Atmospheric Science to map the course of the ash plume, which contained particles of volcanic rock that could cause serious damage to aircraft. 2 research planes were sent to the area, and using sophisticated instruments and computer models, the ash plume's course was tracked, but efforts were also being made to reduce the amount of ash in the atmosphere. A research plane owned by the Facility for Airborne Atmospheric Measurements was sent to the affected areas after being fitted with an instrument that reduced the number of particles using a laser. The plane flew above the ash plume and fired the laser downward, and on the ground, researchers created a map of the plume using computer models. It was found that the plume contained electrically conductive particles that could result in lightning. This is known as St. Elmo's fire, a phenomenon that's been seen many times, and which, as described by witnesses, causes certain parts of an airplane to start glowing. But far more concerning is the fact that it can affect the plane's airspeed indicator, which is an essential part of any aircraft. Furthermore, if the ash were to enter the airplane's engines, it'd cause them to seize up completely, rendering the plane immobile and sending it crashing to the ground below. As a result, more than 104,000 flights were canceled in different areas, 95,000 of which were in Europe alone. This is considered to be the biggest air travel disruption to occur since the Second World War. Today, scientists continue their studies into the prediction of the eruption of volcanoes, but in many cases, they occur without warning, causing widespread disruptions and damage. Most of us will be familiar with the mall Santas that work in shopping malls during the festive season every year. They're usually seated in a large red chair, and children are encouraged by their parents to sit on Santa's lap to tell him what they want for Christmas that year. In most cases, it's a completely innocent activity that's supposed to bring some whimsy into children's lives. But in one particular case, the parents of children in Scarborough, Toronto, Canada, had no idea that the Santa working at the mall was a wanted criminal. The Santa in question was a man named Bruce McArthur, who during the rest of the year worked as a landscaper. He was well known to the people in his community, but they'd be left shocked when in 2018 it came to light that he was a serial killer. McArthur started his crime spree in October of 2001 at the age of 50 when he was in the apartment of his first victim. He assaulted the man with a lead pipe, and after the victim called the police, McArthur handed himself over to the authorities. He stated that he had indeed carried out the attack and added he didn't know why he did it. His victim would eventually make a full recovery. McArthur was arrested and in 2003 charged with assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm. He was handed a conditional sentence of 2 years with 3 years of probation tacked on. Since the attack had taken place in an area known to be frequented by homosexual men, McArthur was prohibited from returning there. And he was also warned to stay away from male street workers, and his DNA was collected. Strangely, he was later pardoned for the crime, a mistake that would later come back to haunt the authorities. In 2010, a man named Skanda Navaratnam was seen leaving the Zippers nightclub with an unknown man, after which he went missing. It would later be determined that McArthur had ended his life on the 6th of January that year, and just 3 months later he would strike again. 42-year-old Abdul Basir Faizi disappeared in December of that year, and his car was later found in Toronto. McArthur would admit to ending Faizi's life on the day that he went missing. He would then go on to end the life of Majid Kayan in October of 2012. And the Toronto police launched Project Houston in an effort to find out what happened to the 3 still missing men. The project would be brought to a close in April of 2014, with McArthur never having been considered a suspect. It would later come to light that he had been interviewed by the police, since he was known to have been involved with all 3 men, but it was never even considered that he may have been responsible for their disappearances. The rest of McArthur's victims include Sarush Mahmoodi, Kirishnakumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lisawick, Salim Essen, and Andrew Kinsman. It was only then that the police started to suspect him, and he was placed under surveillance. On the 18th of January 2018, he was seen spending time with a man whose name has not been made public at his apartment. The police decided to enter the apartment for fear of the man being harmed, and inside, they found the victim tied up but otherwise unharmed. McArthur was arrested and charged with ending the lives of Kinsman and Essen, but many more charges would be added after the full scale of his crime spree came to light. Investigators would later reveal that after ending his victims' lives, McArthur would dispose of their remains in planters at a property in Leaside where he was working. 6 of his victims were found inside these planters, and at his trial, McArthur pleaded guilty to all charges against him. In the latter stages of 2019, the police and military in Chile were embroiled in a delicate situation when a protest held by a group of students escalated into a larger protest that lasted 2 months, and in some instances, they had to resort to using tear gas and fire hoses to disperse the angry crowds. It all started on the 18th of October that year, when the Chilean government announced an increase in the subway fare in Santiago, and students decided to protest against it. Unfortunately, not all of these protests were peaceful, and the police were called in to try to restore order. Soon, protests were being held in several other parts of the country, and the military was deployed, but the protesters were unwilling to disperse, and before long a political crisis was declared. Within just 4 days, 15 people had lost their lives in the ensuing violence and in clashes with the authorities, as more people started to join the protests, but for different reasons. They stated that they had enough of economic inequality in that country, and that something had to be done about it. These events took the Chilean government by surprise, and political parties were asked to convene so that a solution could be found. It was suggested that the country's constitution be replaced, and a new one was drafted. Initially, the new constitution saw a lot of support, but it was ultimately rejected, and in the years that have followed, very little progress has been made. In this photo, which has since been shared all over the internet, protesters can be seen wiping their eyes and leaning against a wall after being exposed to tear gas, highlighting the dire situation that Chile was facing at the time. As the protests continued to escalate, 2 churches were set on fire, one of which was almost completely destroyed. Banks were also targeted, and one police station was attacked with explosives. As is so often the case with violent protests, stores were damaged, and looters started stealing anything they could get their hands on. Nevertheless, the government's efforts to bring calm to the country failed, and when nothing had changed a year later, a fresh set of protests started. This time, 18 police officers were injured while trying to calm the crowd that was demanding that the Constitution be rewritten once more. The government responded by appealing for calm and asking that anyone who had an issue with the Constitution make their feelings known via referendum. They also warned members of the public that anyone who was caught engaging in acts of violence would be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, but this did little to quell the growing violence. During the escalating violence, at least 30 people lost their lives, and thousands more had to receive treatment in hospitals. A second draft of a new constitution was rejected in 2023, and at present, efforts are being made to complete one that will be accepted by all involved, but only time will tell whether a third attempt will be successful. The 24 Hours of Le Mans is the oldest car endurance race in history, which is held in Le Mans, France every year. It's a brutal test of a driver's concentration and ability, and whichever driver covers the most distance in 24 hours is declared the winner. Racing enthusiasts flock to the circuit to watch the event every year, not only to watch their favorite drivers perform, but also because it's considered one of the most dangerous races in all of motorsports. Throughout the years, as many as 22 drivers have lost their lives here, with more than 50% of those incidents taking place on the racecourse's straight, which has only gained more notoriety over the decades. Drivers enter the race fully aware of the dangers they'll be facing, and rely only on their endurance and skill to complete the 24-hour race in hopes of winning tens of thousands of euros and advancing their careers. Spectators have witnessed many crashes at the Le Mans race, but none compare to one particular incident that took place in 1955, the year that British racer Mike Hawthorne walked away with the prestigious trophy. Witnesses would later speak to the media about the incident, stating that Hawthorne had been called into the pits by his crew since he needed to refuel his Jaguar. As he did so, he ended up directly in front of another driver, Lance Macklin, who was racing in an Austin Healey. Macklin had no choice but to swerve aggressively to avoid a collision, and in doing so, his car would end up in front of Pierre Levague, who was trying to make up ground in order to catch up to the race leaders. He was traveling at around 125 miles per hour and had no chance of avoiding Macklin's vehicle. He struck the Austin Healey from the side and quickly burst into flames, to the horror of spectators in the stands. But this was only the very beginning of a far worse tragedy. The collision had caused serious damage to his car, which then started breaking apart. With sparks flying through the air, the car's engine and front axle became dislodged and careened over the protective wall between the circuit and spectators. It happened in the blink of an eye, and witnesses would state that no one in the crowd even had time to react. The engine and axle flew into the stands at great speed, and hundreds of people were struck with debris. On the circuit, rescue teams ran to the scene and found that Leveg was no longer alive. In the stands, police officers and paramedics had their hands full trying to save the lives of spectators who'd been badly injured. And while they were able to render aid to some, more than 80 people lost their lives. One man would recall seeing two of the car's tires flying over his head after he saw the collision and explosion, and moments later he was struck in the head by a piece of metal. He was rushed to the hospital and made a full recovery, but many others were not as lucky. 3 men shown in this photo are in a very dangerous and desperate situation. But what most people tend to forget is that a 4th man, the photographer, is in just as much danger, and in this instance the situation would end in tragedy. The 3 men that we can see are all firefighters who were doing their utmost to gain entry into a warehouse in Beirut, Lebanon, on the 4th of August 2020. But the events leading up to this moment started 7 years earlier in 2013, when a merchant ship called the MV Rosas, which was sailing in the area, started experiencing technical issues. It had set sail from Batumi in Georgia and was heading to Beira in Mozambique, but it was forced to dock in Beirut for repairs. This meant that docking fees had to be paid, but the company that owns the ship failed to do so, and as a result the ship's cargo was removed and stored in this warehouse. Among the cargo was about 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which can be extremely dangerous, and under the right circumstances can be highly explosive. After learning that the cargo was stored in the warehouse, officials from Lebanon's customs department issued several warnings, stating that the ammonium nitrate had to be stored in a very specific way, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. For 7 years, the cargo remained untouched in the warehouse, and a disaster was bound to happen sooner or later. That day arrived on the 4th of August 2020, when a fire broke out at the port, a short distance from the warehouse in this photo. Ammonium nitrate can start to degrade when it's heated in a confined space, but the firefighters who rushed to the scene were unaware that it was being stored in this warehouse. 10 of them started fighting the fire that was encroaching on the warehouse and the cargo that it contained. The 3 firefighters in the photo decided to try and gain entry into the warehouse, and a photographer who was on the scene captured their brave attempt, not knowing that disaster was about to strike. Moments after the photo was taken, the ammonium nitrate detonated, claiming the lives of all 4 men. It would only be later, after the fire had been extinguished, that the photographer's camera was found, and remarkably, the SD card that he was using was undamaged. The resulting blast has been dubbed the largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded, and a large part of the city was completely destroyed. More than 20 people lost their lives, 6,000 were injured, and 100 remained unaccounted for. The blast was so great that it caused as much as $10 billion worth of damage to the city, and 300,000 people were left destitute. In September of 2025, a businessman named Igor Grachushkin was arrested in Bulgaria after it was found that he had links to the ship and its cargo, and Lebanon issued an order to have him extradited, but this process has been delayed, since his attorneys have asked for assurance that he'll not be eligible for the death penalty when he faces trial. In this photo, the Russian ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, is seen standing in front of a microphone as he's about to speak at a conference in December of 2016. Behind him, we see a man who looks to either be his bodyguard or a member of staff at the city's Contemporary Art Center, but the truth is far more unsettling. What isn't immediately apparent in the image is the fact that at the time it was taken, the city of Aleppo in Syria had been regained from Syrian opposition militias by the Syrian government. This was done with the aid of the Russian Air Force, which irked a lot of conservative people in Turkey, who then started to protest. One man took exception to this, and it was Mevlut Mert Altintas, a police officer who hailed from the town of Sok in Turkey. He's the man who can be seen standing behind Karlov in the photo, and unbeknownst to anyone at the photography exhibition, he was about to carry out a heinous plan. The photo exhibition in question was called Russia Through Turks' Eyes, which would likely only have further irritated Altintas, who'd entered the exhibition center by flashing his police badge. This led security personnel at the event to believe that he was one of Karlov's bodyguards, and he was permitted to enter. At first, Karlov's speech went as planned, and the crowd listened to his words intently, but just a few moments later, everything changed. Altintas produced a firearm that he was hiding under his jacket, and he aimed it at Karlov and opened fire, hitting him in the back several times and ending his life. Attendees at the center scrambled for safety, hiding behind pillars and falling to the floor in fear of their lives. The photographer who published the images of the attack knew that his life was also in danger, but he continued to take photos of the unfolding scene and would later be rewarded for his efforts. He would later state that he had no plans of visiting the exhibition that day, but as he drove home, he realized he'd be passing the exhibition, and having heard that Karlov would be delivering a speech, he made a last-minute decision to stop by and take some photos. He could never have imagined that just a few minutes later, he'd be caught up in the middle of an assassination and that his photos would be published worldwide. After ending Karlov's life, Altintas, still holding his firearm, started walking around the room in circles, smashing several of the photographs that were on display. He then started yelling in Turkish and Arabic. At first glance, this image seems to show two hunters standing on a hill, but closer inspection reveals they're actually standing on a mound of bison skulls, which brings into perspective the number of these animals that were hunted during the 19th century. This particular image was captured in Rougeville, Michigan in 1882, and after it was taken, it was estimated that only 456 bison remained alive on the US continent. Just 100 years earlier, the bison population numbered between 30 and 60 million. The tragic decline in their numbers started with the colonization of the West after the arrival of settlers on the continent. With them, they brought powerful weapons that could fell a bison in one fell swoop, and with very little effort. This gave rise to the bison hide and bone trade, which in turn resulted in more hunters seeking out these animals in hopes of turning a profit. Before long, entire herds were completely wiped out, and their numbers quickly started to dwindle. While this is certainly a tragedy, many experts state that the bison were not only hunted for food and trade, but for a far more sinister reason. Until the arrival of settlers on the continent, Native American tribes had fostered close relationships with these animals, which they considered an important resource for their own survival. As the number of bison started to decline, many of these tribes were left decimated, and they had no choice but to relocate to reservations that were under the control of settlers. Many historians suggest that this was no mere coincidence, but a carefully orchestrated plan to take control of these areas, which forced the rightful owners of the land into submission. Tribes that had relied on the bison in the past started faring far worse than those who hadn't, since they now had no way of acquiring food, clothing, shelter, or tools, which were often fashioned out of bones. Not only had they lost one of their most vital resources, but they were also forced to abandon the nomadic lifestyle that they were used to, since they were now forced to remain in reservations that had been established by the settlers. Unfortunately, no laws were put into place to curb the rate at which these animals were hunted, and their near extinction was only quickened by industry. Whenever a new railroad was being constructed, working men needed meat and leather, which were easily procured from the bison via high-powered firearms. In modern times, their numbers have started to climb thanks to conservation efforts, and yet the American bison is still considered to be near threatened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The life of a mountaineer is a dangerous but exciting one that often leads to the discovery of previously unmapped areas, and the feeling of accomplishment after summiting a particularly challenging climb is said to be almost euphoric. While most people may have attempted some level of mountain climbing in their lives, very few of us will ever go as far as trying to summit the tallest mountain on our planet, such as Mount Everest. It's the tallest mountain above sea level, standing more than 29,000 feet high on the border of Nepal and Tibet. It takes a very specific type of person to take on such a daunting task, but thousands of people have made the attempt, with around 7,200 climbers having reached the summit throughout the years. Considering that thousands of people attempt to reach the top each year, the success rate is incredibly low, as most climbers turn back due to rough conditions, lack of oxygen, or a fear of losing their lives in the icy conditions that have claimed more than 340. In 1924, though, no one had ever seen the top of Mount Everest, and several people made it their mission to accomplish this feat. Among the very first were two climbing partners, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, who on the 6th of June 1924 took their first steps onto the mountain. They made it to Camp 5 that day, and on the 7th of June they reached Camp 6, and there they tested their equipment, including oxygen tanks, in preparation for the big climb, which they started on the morning of the 8th. They folded up their two-man tent, gathered all their supplies, and set out, full of hope that they'd be the first two people to ever conquer Everest. One witness, a climber named Noel Odell, would later report that he saw a figure believed to be either Mallory or Irvine in front of him as he started near the summit. The man was seen climbing over a patch of snow just a few hundred feet from the summit, and he soon was joined by his partner. What happened next has been a matter of discussion for decades. Odell stated that moments after spotting the two men, the summit was engulfed by a cloud that hovered over the area for about 15 minutes. He did his best to keep track of the two climbers, but they were obscured from his view by the cloud. When it finally lifted, he expected to see those two companions making their way further up toward the summit, but that was not the case. To his surprise, the two figures had seemingly disappeared, and they were never seen alive again. Some people believe that they made it to the top of the mountain before succumbing to the elements, but this has never been confirmed. Mallory's remains were found in 1999, and when they were analyzed, it was revealed he had suffered a fatal fall. No sign of Irvine's remains were found until 2024, when one of his boots was discovered in the snow, but the mystery of whether the pair summited the mountain remains unsolved, since Irvine's camera, which could contain photos of their last moments, has never been found. This image depicts a group of Polish soldiers on horseback, and one could be forgiven for thinking that it shows a battalion of men who are about to charge their enemy and emerge victorious. The fact is that it was taken shortly before the German invasion of Poland in 1939, and that none of these men made it out alive. The invasion began on the 1st of September that year, with German offenses arriving by land and air. The aim of the attack was to regain territories that had been lost and to take control of the country in the name of Germany. The invading forces used a technique known as blitzkrieg, during which they would first destroy the enemy's railways, communications, planes, and ammunition via bombing before large numbers of soldiers attacked by land. Following this, the infantry would attack and do away with any remaining pockets of opposing soldiers. But before any of this could be done, the Polish army felt that it had a good chance of emerging as the victor in the expected battle. They had a force of 1 million men and could surely hold their own. This was certainly a possibility, were it not for several mistakes that were made early on. Polish soldiers were ill-equipped for a prolonged battle, and when the German side did attack, they fought back head-on rather than with a specific strategy. They relied heavily on their offense rather than retreating to more favorable ground, and it soon became clear that those in charge of the Polish army were used to the antiquated fighting techniques and strategies. Still, they had hope that aid would come from Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, who they believed to be allies. But that hope was dashed with the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Pact, which stipulated that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack each other for the next 10 years. It also contained a secret stipulation whereby Eastern Europe was divided into German and Soviet spheres of influence. This included the partitioning of Poland, and hence that country unwittingly stood on the precipice of disaster. The invasion officially began on the 1st of September 1939, when a German battleship attacked a Polish military transit depot in Danzig. This was followed by an attack, which was considered by many historians to be the very beginning of the Second World War. Soon, several cities were under attack, as were Poland's southern, western, and northern borders. News of the attacks spread quickly, and on the 3rd of September, France and Britain declared war on Germany. But they failed to provide any useful support. The Polish army saw some success during smaller skirmishes, but for the most part, they were overrun thanks to Germany's modern equipment, technical superiority, and sheer number of soldiers. Polish soldiers were forced to retreat to Warsaw, with some fleeing into Romania. The Polish forces saw major Air Force bases destroyed within just 2 days, and hence the German Air Force saw very little resistance. Within the first week, Pomerelia, Greater Poland, and Upper Silesia were abandoned, and the borders were overrun. From the 9th of September to the 19th, the largest of the 3 battles took place near the Bezura River. Polish forces were overpowered by German aircraft. Bridges over the river were destroyed, leaving soldiers trapped, and many lost their lives in the air bombings that followed. Polish anti-aircraft weapons no longer had any ammunition left and were quickly wiped out. This was followed by an invasion by the Soviet Union, and when all was said and done, Poland had fallen. It was divided up between Germany and the Soviet Union, and it would only be in 1993 that the Soviet soldiers finally left the country after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1989. The Chernobyl disaster, which occurred on the 25th of April, 1986, remains one of the most terrifying and destructive man-made disasters in all of human history. It's still noted today for the mishandling of this situation, not only by staff at the plant, but also by the Russian government, which failed to warn the rest of the world in time. One of the worst factors of the disaster was the fact that residents of Pripyat, an atom-clad city that was built to house workers at the Chernobyl plant and their families, also weren't warned of the impending danger after a massive explosion rocked the plant. An image that's been shared far and wide shows the residents of Pripyat walking through the city streets without a care in the world just weeks before the disaster, and it's hard to believe that that very same area has now been declared uninhabitable and will remain so for thousands of years to come. It all started during an experiment that was carried out at the plant's number 4 reactor on the 25th of April that year. But the experiment was filled with flaws, and when the reactor's power-regulating system was purposefully shut down, a series of events started to unfold that would end in the unmitigated disaster. The plant's emergent safety systems were disabled, and the control rods that were present in the nuclear core were withdrawn, leaving the reactor at a power level of just 7%. Inexperienced technicians started voicing their concerns that the experiment was not being carried out correctly, but the plant's deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, admonished them for being cowards and ordered the test to go ahead. At one point, he was made aware of the fact that the control rods had been drawn out too far and that their graphite tips were no longer submerged. But again, he refused to believe this and forged ahead. As soon as the control rods were lowered back down, an unstoppable chain reaction was set into motion, and the reactor's nuclear core not only exploded, but was exposed to the outside world, sending unimaginable amounts of radiation into the surrounding area and the Earth's atmosphere. It was estimated that as much as 5% of the core was released, and these dangerous particles started to drift towards Europe. 2 men lost their lives as a result of the explosion, and it would have been immediately apparent that the residents of Pripyat were in immediate danger. But no word was sent to the city, though most residents knew that something had happened at the plant, since the raging fire was visible from some distance away. It was only 2 days later that they were told to evacuate the city, and around 30,000 people fled for their lives. In the meantime, the rest of the world was left oblivious to the disaster, as the Russian government refused to acknowledge that an accident had even taken place. It would only be when high levels of radiation were reported in Sweden and Finland on the 28th that the full extent of the disaster came to light. In 1910, the race to become the first expedition to reach the South Pole was on, and one British explorer, Captain Robert Falcon Scott, had made up his mind that he and his men would be the ones to do so. But he wasn't merely chasing recognition. He and his crew were also planning on conducting research along the Ross Ice Shelf, specifically in the Victoria Land region. From the get-go, Scott and his chief scientist, Edward Adrian Wilson, had differing opinions on the ultimate goal of the expedition. Wilson felt that the scientific research that was about to be conducted at the ice shelf should be the main priority, but Scott had his mind set on becoming the first explorer to reach the South Pole in the name of Britain, and he was anxious to get going since an expedition from Norway was preparing to do the same. On the 15th of June, 1910, Scott's crew was assembled and ready, and they set off on their journey with a few guests on board who would also be given certain duties to perform. They set sail from Cardiff, Wales, but Scott would only join his crew later on in South Africa, as he'd been delayed by certain details that had to be ironed out. By January of 1911, they'd reached Antarctica, where they faced temperatures of around -70 Fahrenheit. For the next 10 months, they readied themselves for the trek to the South Pole and set out from their base camp on the 1st of November. Not long into the journey, they had to abandon their motorized sledges due to the rough terrain, and their ponies started to suffer due to the harsh conditions and minimal food. By the 4th of January, though, they'd made good progress and were preparing for the final push to the pole. Scott decided that only a few of his crew would go ahead, and he chose 4 men to accompany him on the last 150 miles of the journey. The other 4 men turned back to base camp, with one man suffering from scurvy and snow blindness along the way, but he managed to survive thanks to the efforts of his companions. Scott's party forged ahead and reached the South Pole on the 17th of January, but they were left distraught upon spotting dog tracks in the snow. And to make matters worse, a Norwegian flag had been planted by an earlier expedition. The men's morale was devastated by the discovery, and 2 days later they started back to base camp with the knowledge that they had lost the race. Nevertheless, they continued gathering geological samples whenever they could, despite fearing for their lives as they were running very low on supplies. Scurvy, hypothermia, and starvation had started to set in, and at one point they stopped to take the photo in question, and it's clear from the expressions on their faces, they felt defeated and worse for wear. Shortly after reaching the base of Beardmore Glacier, Edward Evans passed away after sustaining a serious head injury. Captain Frank Oates knew there were too many mouths to feed, and while suffering from frostbite, decided to walk out into the frozen wasteland, never to return, giving up his life so that the remainder of the party would survive. But the thing is, this was done in vain. The rest of the crew wrote letters to their families, and 8 months later, a rescue party found their tents with their frozen remains inside. Most of us will never get the chance to view some of history's most famous artworks, such as the paintings created by Rembrandt van Rijn, Vincent van Gogh, and sculptures created by the likes of Michelangelo. While it's possible to view some of these pieces in museums all over the world, many people don't have the means to ever travel to those areas, and hence they have to make do with viewing these works via the internet or photos taken by others. One of the most famous paintings ever created is Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers, which predictably shows a vase with several sunflowers against a yellow background. It's the second in a series of 2 paintings, the first of which shows the flowers lying on the ground. Most people are unaware that several versions of each of these paintings were created by Van Gogh, one of which was on display in room 43 in London's National Gallery in 2022. Tourists flocked to the gallery to get a rare glimpse of the masterpiece, and they could never have expected what happened on the 14th of October that year. On that day, activists from Just Stop Oil, a group now known as Take Back Power, entered the gallery and made a beeline for room 43. They then approached the sunflowers painting and removed their jackets, revealing the Just Stop Oil shirts that they were wearing underneath. The 2 activists would later be identified as 21-year-old Phoebe Plummer, who hailed from London, and 20-year-old Anna Holland from Newcastle. Without a second thought, the 2 women produced cans of tomato soup, which they then opened, and they took aim at the painting. A photo from the incident shows the aftermath of the demonstration, with most of the sunflowers obscured by tomato soup. Visitors of the gallery were visibly shaken, and gasps could be heard echoing through the room as the 2 women attempted to destroy a priceless and historic work of art. But they weren't done just yet. Next, they produced tubes of strong glue, which they then spread over the palms of their hands before gluing themselves to the gallery wall next to the painting they had just defaced. They could then be heard shouting, "What's worth more, art or life? Is it worth more than food, more than justice? Are you more concerned about the protection of a painting or the protection of our planet and people?" They then went on to speak about the fact that fuel had become unaffordable and stated that the high price of oil was directly linked to the increasing cost of living in countries around the world. After the two were arrested, Phoebe was handed a 2-year sentence, while Anna was handed a sentence of 20 months behind bars. This image shows a beach with a few beachgoers wading out into the water and a sailboat drifting nearby. At first glance, it's a tranquil and fun scene, but in reality, it serves as a precursor to an unspeakable tragedy that occurred on the 26th of December, 2004. What isn't immediately apparent in this photo is the fact that the area's shoreline has retracted much further than it usually does, even at low tide. Those in the know will tell you that if this ever happens while you're at the beach, you should do your utmost to flee and find higher ground as soon as possible. The reason for this warning is that a tsunami is about to strike, and this image serves as solid proof of that fact. On this day, a magnitude 9.1 undersea earthquake occurred in the waters off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia, but the people in the photo were none the wiser. Just moments later, a massive tsunami started speeding towards the coast, and it's safe to assume that no one in this photo managed to escape its destructive force. It was followed by a series of tsunamis that formed in the Indian Ocean over the following 7 hours, causing massive amounts of damage and ending the lives of thousands of people. Some of these tsunamis reached as far as the eastern coast of Africa, and in some areas, witnesses described seeing waves as tall as 30 feet barreling toward the coast and then destroying everything in their paths. To this day, it's considered one of the worst natural disasters to have ever occurred. Within hours, tens of thousands of people were unaccounted for and were either reported as missing or found deceased. 15 countries were affected by the quake and the resulting tsunamis, including Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand and India. Indonesia was by far the worst affected, as it was reported that as many as 200,000 people lost their lives, most of whom hailed from one single province. What followed was a struggle for survival as people were left without shelter, clean drinking water, and food. Relief organizations did their best to aid those in need, but the number of people who needed help was overwhelming, and many areas had been left inaccessible thanks to roads that were destroyed. The photo in question serves as a stark reminder of how quickly a situation can change from one of bliss and tranquility to one of terror and loss. This image may seem like a still image from a blockbuster disaster movie that cost millions of dollars to make, but in reality, it shows just a small portion of the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005. The first sign of trouble appeared on the 23rd of August that year, when a tropical depression started to form over the Bahamas. Its progress was tracked by the National Hurricane Center, which noted that it had started to develop into a much stronger weather system, and by the following day, it was reclassified as a tropical storm. The Bahamas were now directly below the storm, but on the 25th of August, it changed course and started heading west towards Miami. Just a few hours before the storm made landfall in Miami, it was upgraded to a level 1 hurricane and given the name Katrina. By this time, wind speeds as high as 75 miles per hour were recorded, and at around 6:30 that evening, Katrina made landfall between Miami and Hollywood. Residents of those areas were warned to remain in their houses and to seek shelter as the winds had picked up to speeds of around 80 miles per hour, with no signs of slowing down. Along with high winds came cascading rain, and over the course of 6 hours, these areas saw around 5 inches of rainfall. At one point, it was speculated that the hurricane would lose strength and hopefully die out, but when it reached the Gulf of Mexico, it gathered strength once again and was upgraded to a level 2 hurricane. By 5 o'clock the following morning, it had morphed into a Category 3 hurricane, and wind speeds as high as 115 miles per hour were being reported. But this was only the beginning, as the storm only worsened, and by the 28th of August, it was classified as a level 5 threat with winds of 160 miles per hour and higher, damaging everything in its path. Warnings were sent out to Louisiana, Alabama, and western Florida as the storm had changed direction once again and was heading that way. Within hours, the true extent of the storm became apparent when winds of over 170 miles per hour were recorded, and Katrina developed into one of the worst storms to ever hit the Atlantic. When the storm finally passed, $125 billion in damage had been done, and as many as 1,800 people lost their lives, most of whom lived in Louisiana. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.